Outrage at the death of George Floyd has led to protests here in Europe, and more are planned this week, calling for police reform. In Paris, thousands protested the death of Adama Traoré, a black man who died in police custody. The French government responded by banning officers from using chokeholds on suspects, but now police are pushing back, using their cars to block the Champs-Élysées in the centre of the capital. Well, in a few minutes, we'll cross over to our journalist in London, Victoria Smith. But first, let's speak to our international correspondent, Annalise Borges, who's in Paris for us. Annalise, it seems as if the police are having to, or rather the government are having to tread a fine line between managing the expectations and the anger of police and also the anger of people who want to take to the streets to march against racism. What's the message that French leaders are sending out now?
Hi there, Tokes. Well, it depends who that message is addressed to. There really seems to be a lot of contradiction at the moment. On the one hand, French officials and leaders in this country saying that they understand the anger, they understand and acknowledge that French police might have a problem and will look into it. While on the other hand, saying that the police as an institution is not racist and that officers should not all be tarred with the same brush. What is clear is that George Floyd's killing has found a strong echo here in France, and it has revived this debate about policing these ethnically diverse suburbs around the country, and for decades populations of Arab and African origins complain that they are unfairly treated by police. This case, George Floyd's case, has also brought to the public attention another case that was actually not widely known outside activist circles, the case of Adama Traoré, as you mentioned, the 24-year-old who died in police custody 4 years ago. No one was charged with that killing, and his family has been campaigning here in France for justice, a campaign, a fight they say is that of an entire country. Take a listen.
It horrifies us, makes our blood run cold, and it reminds us of my little brother. They were both put in chokeholds. Adama had 3 policemen on him. George Floyd had 3 policemen on him. They said the same words. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Now, Annalise, with tensions running high across France, the French President Emmanuel Macron is due to make a pre-recorded address on Sunday to the nation. Do we have any idea of what he's going to say?
Not really, Tokes. We rarely know what Emmanuel Macron is going to say before he says it. We never get copies, embargoed copies of his speeches. For example, there's talk that he might announce a reform in law enforcement here in this country. But again, it's going to be hard to predict. What Macron seems to be wanting to do is look ahead. He's looking ahead to define what this last 2 years of his term will be. He's trying to define what his legacy will consist of. But he keeps being pulled back, it seems. And of course, he's now going to have to try and appease a population, 2 very different sides of one complex story, that of racial and social inequality here in this country, all the while dealing with a massive economic crisis and, of course, that public health emergency, the spread of COVID-19. We have the pandemic under control here in this country, but there are fears that the virus could once again start to spread. And there are fears that doctors and nurses are extremely tired and that the hospital, the healthcare system here in this country will not be able to deal with a second wave of infections. And so it's going to be a very difficult moment for Emmanuel Macron, a very important speech. He knows that. His team knows that. They are all working to prepare and to find the right tone, a tone that is going to be very difficult to strike because he's going to have to be appeasing, understanding, all the while sounding determined to go ahead and to move ahead in this country.
A delicate time here in France. Annalise Borges reporting for us from the French capital. Thank you. Now, UK authorities are bracing for potential unrest at protests planned for this weekend. Some statues have been protected after a spate of monuments were vandalised and toppled. The Mayor of London is urging people to stay at home over fears that demonstrators could get infected with COVID-19 and that rival groups could end up clashing. Craig Crowther has this report.
Boxed in a way he never was in life, officials in London have covered an iconic statue of Winston Churchill and other significant monuments over fears they could be damaged during weekend protests. The war leader's likeness was vandalised during a recent event linked to the Black Lives Matter campaign. It was among several damaged around the country. The Prime Minister has condemned those attacking property and the police.
What's happened with these demonstrations is that a tiny minority, or actually a growing minority, unfortunately, have hijacked them, and they are using them as a pretext to attack the police, to cause violence, and to cause damage to public property.
Black Lives Matter organisers have cancelled a march in London planned on Saturday, but the city's mayor fears protests and potentially violent counter-demonstrations could still occur.
We're keen to avoid any vandalism, any violence and any disorder. And that's why I'd encourage anybody who feels strongly about Black Lives Matter to stay at home and find other ways to have their voices heard.
The UK has been caught up in the worldwide unrest sparked by the killing of George Floyd in the United States. Some have turned their anger on memorials to the country's colonial rulers and prominent slave leaders. Craig Crowther, Euronews.
Well, the Mayor of London's plea for people to stay away hasn't been heeded by hundreds of peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters who are currently gathering in Trafalgar Square. Well, our reporter Victoria Smith is nearby in Westminster and she joins us now. Victoria, before these monuments and statues were boarded up, we had far-right demonstrators who said that they were going to defend them. Are they still planning to do that?
As far as I know, Tokes, yes, you can see, I'm standing in Parliament Square now, and you can see just here behind me, you can see the boarded up statue, completely boarded up statue of Winston Churchill. That has been attracting some attention throughout the day, but now the rain set in, there aren't so many here. Obviously, this square, Parliament Square, is famous for its statues of political figures such as Gandhi, David Lloyd George. Just Winston Churchill is boarded up. Now, this was the target of some graffiti, some protest over the weekend, the Black Lives Matter protest. One of the protesters sprayed the statue with graffiti saying Churchill was a racist. That was cleaned up. Now it's been boarded up. And that's, as you say, ahead of this potential clash tomorrow. There was meant to be a Black Lives Matter protest, which has been officially cancelled, although, of course, we don't know whether people will still turn up. But coming from all over the country, being bussed in, are a group of far-right activists led by a divisive figure, Tommy Robinson, the political group, the far-right political group, Britain First, and they're appealing to a Facebook group called the Democratic Football Lads Alliance. They're being bussed in from around the country against advice, particularly because of COVID. Some are coming from the northwest where the figure is high. And if they do turn up tomorrow, and we understand some are camping tonight, then the police fear that there could be a clash. And that's why measures have been taken to protect the statues, and there is a big police presence here this evening.
Victoria, according to media reports, the government is preparing a fast-track procedure in case there's any unrest. What more can you tell us about that?
That's right. They're saying that violent protesters will be jailed within 24 hours. Now, this is stepping up from what we saw last week when the police were largely fairly placid, keeping their distance. Some even took the knee on a protest that I attended. That is changing a bit because there was sporadic violence at the weekend protests. We began to see kettling, which is when police put on riot gear and they pen in a group of protesters. They surround them and keep them contained for as many hours as they like. They're allowed to do this if they fear there could be trouble otherwise. So some protesters are complaining that they were kept penned in for hours and hours as it got dark and cold, and they got hungry and they were kept there with no real reason given, no arrests being made. So we are seeing things start to step up. You may be able to hear above me there are 2 police helicopters which have been here throughout the afternoon. I've seen about 6 to 8 police vans circling the square
full of police officers. And there are signs of people coming into the square with bedding, perhaps going to camp the night. I've seen some football supporters as well. So we'll have to wait to see what the weekend holds. But yes, I think we can expect a bigger reaction than we have seen so far from the government and the police.
Victoria Smith, our reporter in the UK capital, on those measures the government's taking ahead of those expected protests this weekend. Thank you.